against climate change. Today we'll be hearing from Nagaraj Adve, who many of you know, I'm sure, but who's been writing on issues of climate change and the science of climate change. He has an invaluable introductory overview out, which are in a number of languages: Hindi, Telugu, Tamil, Kannada. And today he'll be talking to us about climate change during and beyond COVID. And we're looking forward to hearing about this, about the effects of the current lockdown in a number of countries, including prominently China, USA, and India. So it should be fascinating. Just one word of housekeeping before we begin. I'd request everyone to just keep indicating in the chat when they have questions, even during the talk. And then I'll be able to see and ask people to come online to ask their questions once we're ready for that at the end. Okay. So with that, over to you, Naga. Looking forward.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Anish, and thank you all for joining us today. So there's a reason why I started with this particular slide, which is basically to highlight the urgency of the climate crisis. And this slide from a paper published last year shows how different ecosystems and regions throughout the world are very close to tipping points. And tipping points basically are where an ecosystem can tip over into a new state, and also, largely speaking, it would be irreversible. And many of these points that I mentioned here across the world, some of them are already crossed tipping points, and some of them are very, very close. The point I'm making is that it's not as if the urgency of climate change is very, very far away. It's already here. It's already in the present. And these are interconnected systems. So what it means is that actually, if one system tips, it will contribute towards a second system tipping. This is actually not the subject of my talk today. My subject of the talk today is mainly emissions for the last 10 years, but it has a bearing. Emissions in the last 10 years has a bearing on how these ecosystems will play out for centuries to come. So actually what I'm going to cover today is this. Very briefly, I'll touch upon climate impacts in this year. Mainly, I'm going to talk about energy use and emissions in particular. And why am I focusing on emissions? Because emissions in the entire climate landscape, emissions are the most crucial thing. Everything else follows. Impacts, climate politics, climate finance, all the rest of it. Carbon dioxide in particular, and when I say emissions, I mean, of course, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, but in particular, carbon dioxide, because of its lifespan, are the most crucial, and that's why I'm focusing on it today. I'll also talk about what may change because of COVID, and how do those changes sort of face up to earlier structural trends. And in conclusion, we'll raise a few questions, and maybe I'll offer a few strategies that may be relevant for India. So starting off on climate impacts. So one key thing is that some people are surprised as to why climate impacts were still unfolding this year, particularly before Amphan. And those have continued worldwide. Last month was the warmest May ever measured since instrumental records began in 1880. And in India, we've seen Amphan, which is not to suggest that necessarily a specific climate event is necessarily because of climate change. One can't assume that, but it's just very likely that the intensity of cyclones along the eastern coast and the frequency of cyclones along the western coast, say Nisarga, which was about at Bombay, etc., are certainly fueled by warmer oceans. And that's because 90% of all the heat trapped by greenhouse gases goes into the oceans. And these are some trends I've sort of put down from this landmark report that came out just last week. I hope one of its authors, Chirag, has joined us. It's something that I think everybody should read. And among the key impacts it talks about, mind you, these are present impacts, okay, since 51. The Indian Ocean, the Northern Indian Ocean in particular, is warming more than India's landmass. That influences the way that the monsoon has already begun to play out. As a consequence, it's reducing by 6%, but this is an overall average. There's a lot of unevenness within a season, and so there could be many days of very dry weather, and suddenly in 2 or 3 days, there could be a lot of very intense rainfall, and that's something that farmers have been telling us several years, and that's something that if you all are from different towns or places, is something all of you may itself have experienced. Droughts have sort of intensified, and I could go on. There are many other key impacts it talks about, and one of the more interesting findings is how sea level rise has been accelerating in recent years, over the last 25 years or so, along the Indian coast. And that affects people all along the Indian coast and particularly in the Sundarbans. But if we're talking about, say, the effects of cyclones, this was one such which hit last year, Orissa in particular. And one key point I want to make is the question of justice and injustice, about how those who are least responsible, whether it is in the Sundarbans, or whether it is in Orissa, whether it is in central India, are those that are hit the most. And my friend, very close friend Bhubanesh was telling me how bastis were destroyed and also how people are protesting because of lack of water, etc. And this is an impact after impact. I don't have the time to talk about this today very much. I do talk about this usually, but there's something that I think we should never forget: the sheer injustice of climate change. And this also is the case in the Sundarbans, both recently in Amphan, but also in a long-term sea level rise, which in the Sundarbans, incidentally, is accelerated because of certain specific geological factors. And the sea level rise there is more than is the case in other parts of Indian coast. But one thing that was so evident when I was talking to people, that is how in home after home after home, people have basically have had to migrate several times, and they would point to the sea and talk about where they used to live earlier when they were children. Now, why is it that climate change is as bad this year? We obviously know that pollution is better, right? We've seen it. So it's to do with the lifespans. Now, typical air pollutants have a very short lifespan in the atmosphere. It's up there. And this is very sharp contrast to carbon dioxide, which has a lifespan of thousands of years to actually tens of thousands of years. And so it's its accumulation in the atmosphere is what actually matters. And the current rates of the current levels of carbon dioxide, which is
Naga, I can't hear you.
Now? Now?
Yeah, I think we can hear Naga.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, okay. So I say that the current levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is roughly above 400 parts per million, is what they were 4 million years ago. That's what that Nature paper said. And the point about why climate is bad this year is that the current impacts are largely due to past emissions. And the heat energy trapped by greenhouse gases every second is roughly that. Which means that in the time that you attend this particular webinar, greenhouse gases would have trapped roughly the energy equal to 36,000 Hiroshima bombs, which is 432,000 Hiroshima bombs every single day, more or less, for the last 50 years. And that's going to continue. And one of the things I wondered in March, in fact, in February or March, was whether actually the Earth might get warmer. Now, that might seem a bit strange, but because the regular pollutants tend to reflect energy or reflect sun's energy, etc., and particularly these two, and this is based on a paper I read in PNAS in 2009. I actually wrote to this extremely regarded scientist. I can't take his name because his response was a very sort of brief personal response. This is what he said. He said it was likely that if we had this sort of shutdown for a longer period, then it would have a detectable warming effect on the planet. Whether that has happened or will happen at all, I think it's for future studies to let us know. But the point is that climate essentially is as bad now as it was last year or worse, but socially it's actually worse. And why? Because we can't ever look at climate change impacts, in an abstract sense. The way it's very much contextualized depending on inequality, social context, agrarian context, and so on. And this year, I think that the poor, I'm hypothesizing a bit, would be hit by 3 blows in successive waves. Initially, the loss of livelihoods for literally millions of people, followed by varied climate change impacts. And so far, we've seen already heat stress and possibly Amphan. And now COVID is going to impact. It's already, in fact, expanding in the last few days in Bombay and Delhi and Chennai and other places. And this is going to get a lot worse, I'm sorry to say, in the next few weeks. So basically, the poor are going to hit. So these are interconnected. I mean, if you've lost your job, if you're eating once a day, and then you get hit by a loss of crop, and then you get hit by COVID, your body is essentially much weaker. And these are basically interconnected assaults on the poor that's going to intensify this year. And also the case is that normally when people get hit by a climate change induced drought or a flood or any other such impact, they have the potential, and people we've talked to say about how they immediately sort of travel, and particularly the men do very often, say go to Surat or go to other places looking for jobs. But right now there simply aren't jobs available, as you know. And this is something I also want to intensify. Simply the mental stress due to COVID. And that's something that, I mean, all of us are facing this right now. We hear bad news, it's on TV all the time. People we know are in hospital or relatives of people we know are in hospital. The mental stress is acute. Imagine if that gets intensified by somebody in the family having lost a job this year, and then a loss of crop or something else, and then COVID. I mean, that mental stress is so deep, and it's something that I think it does not get sufficient attention. And that again is something that's going to intensify this year. So in a sense, if something's going to affect the poorest social groups in this country in a way that's going to be deeply acute in this year. And this is in fact a study from migration from a project of Prabhu's students, they presented a few days ago. Now the question is that what happens when it gets worse? I mean, I couldn't think of any other way of talking about this, this kind of large font. I mean, this is this year, and this at the present is your largest impact. This might rise somewhat, but this is still the largest. Now, what happens, let's say 15 years from now, when climate change becomes more intense, when the kind of sea level rise hitting people in the Sundarbans goes all along India's 7,000-kilometer coastline. And this is going to happen every single year. And that year, you could have a poor farmer who might lose his crop, who might have something in the family, someone in the family gets TB, someone. But climate change is going to be like, possibly like a COVID, and it's going to happen every single year. Which is not to say that it's going to happen like COVID, but I'm just trying to emphasize the point that as climate change intensified, is something that's going to be something that's going to happen every single year in a way that I think we don't entirely fathom. I'm now going to shift a bit, track actually, and talk about this. And I really must apologize about the numbers. There's going to be a lot of numbers coming up. So here was change of tracks coming here. Yeah. Now we're moving to this year. Now, what happened with COVID? So China was the first epicenter of COVID. And one point, if we forget about China, is actually that it doesn't just have a lot of trade, it also has a very large internal market, which actually is a size that is twice as large as India's economy. And this year in 2020, several economies were hit very sharply because of the way tourism was hit. Very key sectors, transport in particular, with shipping, aviation in different places, affected these key fuels, oil and coal, which are very central to emissions and hence change. And also there was such a wide loss of jobs worldwide. There's a 50 million estimate in China, India's numbers because of CMIE, in the US, elsewhere in Europe for a while, and some of these countries have benefits, but those only for a few months. So if we take this year as a whole, it's going from way out of way from China to Europe, which had supply and demand. We've got these negative impacts that have come by now. People for this year with different sources, ranging from between a -6% to a -7%. Now, that obviously causes a decline in fossil fuel use, but from what levels? Now, this slide, let's focus on the numbers in red. This was the only year recently in which there was a slight dip in energy in 2009. And notice the rebound that took place in 2010. After 2009, it sort of goes up to 2010. And down here, there are these numbers in bold, which are the highest consumption for that particular fuel in any given year. And notice that both oil and gas are at their peak in the most recent year. And renewables is just merely at 4%. This for 2018. And the point here is that ever since 2009, despite a very slower rate of growth, you've got sort of energy use worldwide increasing by over by so much every single year. So it may be slower, but this sort of links to questions of growth centrally and also to questions of degrowth and post-growth that Rajeshwari had spoken about recently. When you've got an economic system that's constantly growing, even if it's growing at a slower rate, you're going to have constant energy use just rising year after year after year. And in fact, the latest data for 2019, which came out 3 or 4 days, maybe a couple of days ago, and I got to see it only today, even last year, there's a slower rate of rise. However, it's still rising, even last year, 2019. And I'm now going to move to specific fuels. Now, one key trend with oil in general has been this exceptional rise of oil in the US in the last decade or so. And that sort of changed oil markets in very significant ways. It's also influenced the way that we looked at certain resource crunches, in particular peak oil. It certainly postponed peak oil. But what happened as a consequence of the kind of economic decline that I talked about here is that rather here, the consumption of oil fell very sharply by about 23 million barrels a day. And the prices obviously fell. And this had, so this sort of a peak of about 100 million barrels a day. And we got a very sharp fall in by April, December, April, June average, with prices then crashing from 71 to about 20. And this had a very unequal effects on economies. And India is typically an oil importing economy. It imports about 83% of its crude. But if you look at oil exporting countries like Ecuador and Russia, you got extremely unequal impacts on smaller countries like Ecuador or maybe some others as compared to larger. It also benefits the larger oil companies like Exxon at the cost of smaller ones. And it's also possible that some refinery projects as a consequence of the price crash may not happen, which also then influences people there. And one widely reported consequence was that a particular oil in the US fell to minus 37 bar, which basically meant that production was carrying on and people had no place to store it. And so you're basically paying people to store your oil. And so price fell to negative $37. But as a consequence of all this, it's estimated that oil consumption, which is one key contributor to emissions, would be down by 9%. But this is only an estimate right now. This could well go up. And what about gas? Now, gas is generally seen over the last few years as a bridge fuel between our fossil fuel intense world right now and the future might rely more on renewables. And it is a key part of the fuel mix in several countries, not so much in India, where it's only 6% of the basket, but in many of these countries it is. In 2020, there were many factors why gas consumption didn't fall as much as the others, but one factor why it was already low is that we had milder winters in the US. And the estimated gas consumption in 2020 right now is that it will go below 4. And what about coal, which is the key, which is, it's been facing, of course, a long-term shift to gas and renewables. And coal consumption fell, and particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere, because electricity demand during the shutdown in many places, including in India, fell very sharply. And coal is used both obviously in electricity, but also in industry. And in India, coal use also fell both in 2020 and in 2019. And coal consumption might fall the most. It will fall by 8% likely this year. And it's probably the sort of breaks because it depends a lot upon what happens in other key countries of coal consumption, particularly the US and in China. Renewables. Renewables is possibly one of the few good stories of this year. And because renewables sort of carry on sort of producing despite the lockdown, you've got a higher renewable use. And part of it is what you prepare for. The fact that capacity was expanded, I'm talking about worldwide here in 2018 and 2019, it's partly because why renewables has grown. And in a sense, it also was a glimpse for people who manage renewables. How do you manage a much higher renewable use with a much lower demand for electricity overall? And consumption might rise slightly in 2020, unlike the other sources. But however, investment this year might fall, possibly about 13%, which basically means that there'll be a far reduced capacity of renewables this year, probably likely with 13%. Taking overall, it's a renewable story, and like I said, this is one of the few sort of positive stories for this year, but it's also got this. So this is actually something that an engineer in Tata Solar told me. So for every panel, every 15 days, you need to use 2 liters of water. And every megawatt sort of needs 4,000 panels. So we do the maths, for any 1,000 megawatt plant, and typically nowadays, our solar parks are very huge, like this plant in Karnataka. So every 1,000 megawatt plant needs 5.3 lakh liters of water daily. And that might seem not very much for an industry or whatever, but very often you know that they come up in areas with not very much water. And then of course, there's the issue of land, which operates in some areas where you might potentially take away land from agriculture. It may operate less in other areas such as Ladakh, where you're planning a very huge 7,500 megawatt kind of plants there. But certainly it's an issue for India. And one key issue for India for solar and wind is that, and this is something that concerns unions, is that typically in the private sector, in renewables, the workers are very poorly paid. And I've talked to workers briefly from wind power plants, and they talked of their wage, and they actually had to leave because their wages were so low. They were about 7,000-8,000 rupees few years ago. And also that the sector is very deeply unorganized. But this is not to confuse the fact that I am for solar and wind, but the question is that the energy that we are using, taking from somewhere else, and Delhi does that a lot, what do we use them for is, I think, one key point, if this is a constraint. Let's move to key countries. I'll take a slight break here. Can you all still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this is a really interesting photo of a highway outside Beijing. I actually counted the lanes, and starting from here, going to here, it's actually 47 lanes across. It's something that tells us a lot about China. And there's a reason why China is the key, and it's worth just taking a look at this. China is the only economy in the world that's huge and also has a very high level of growth. But it is last year, and this data is from this BP report that came out a couple of days ago. It's like 33/4 of all the energy increase last year was by China. But it's actually this bit that actually still blows my mind, and I read it a few weeks ago. This China's emissions, which took place massively, and it is by some distance the largest carbon dioxide emitter in the world, was because of the urbanization and the growth in infrastructure that took place. It was emitting more carbon dioxide in 3 years from concrete than the US did in the entire 10th, 20th century. And as we know, China became the factory of the world. And that's an issue nowadays because China manufactures about 68% of India's mobile phones and a lot else. And this, I think, is central to the spread of capitalism in the last 25 years, including to China. Now, what about China now? So this is the story with China now. There was an estimate of a job loss, and the government tried to do this. They both tried to, this investment they tried to do was mainly to develop infrastructure. In the short term, China would try to boost its infrastructure. In the long term, it's trying to focus on consumption. But its current investment is largely to do with infrastructure. And some proxy data in April suggested that how the Chinese economy was already picking up. There was a survey done of 12 cities, of 240 restaurants, and they found them sort of reasonably full. And by May, China was producing sort of 62% of the world's steel, which is simply staggering. And it's partly because, so this, what's already happening in China sort of affects what a lot of people are demanding, which is a green recovery following COVID. These are the constraints that China faces right now, and particularly sort of export markets being, not very strong in Europe, in the US. And this is interesting, this Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which is well over 100 countries, but which are primarily sort of high investment projects in coal, in ports, in roads, and other very high energy. And whatever when I think of them, the fact is they're very highly energy intensive projects in over 100 countries. And many of them are kind of slowing down because of COVID. And that's sort of the constraint that China faces. It's sort of moving to the US very briefly. It saw a government response with a fiscal stimulus of 2 trillion and a high unemployment insurance, but that sort of end in a few weeks. There's also a very high level of uncertainty, as we know, because of a possibility of a second wave. But what's pretty interesting for me is what's at the end. The US, as being sort of the largest exporter of oil and gas in the world, is again beginning to import oil. And what happens in the US has a great bearing on fossil fuel use and emissions sort of going forward. Very briefly on India, which a lot of you already know about, so I won't dwell on it very much, but just simply the combination of sort of incompetence and sort of vicious government response that took place. I mean, what can one say? But energy demand overall has sort of declined by sort of 30% during the lockdown, and many kinds of fuels have kind of declined, including diesel, which is key for irrigation and transport. And the government, in contrast, has sort of begun to introduce various reforms that intensify fossil fuel use, including the EIA, including the fact that washing is not needed. And it's sort of opened out coal mining to the private commercial sector in 41 blocks, which in many ways is going to intensify fossil fuel use. sort of moving on, what does all of this, both about the key fuels and about the key countries, imply for energy demand in 2020? This energy demand over the last century or so, and this at the end indicates that it's the steepest drop in energy demand in the last possibly 70 years since the Second World War. It's down by about 7%. The key point is that for emissions, which fuel is declining? And it's mainly coal and oil. And that's the key point here, is that how will emissions fall depends on which source sort of gets impacted. And going to that, about what the level of emissions might be, which is one key point of this presentation to summarize. The study suggests that emissions are declined by 7% this year. And this is in many ways unprecedented. And that, the last time this happened in 2009, it was barely 1%. But it won't surprise me, given the current rates of growth decline, if it was higher. If it was maybe even 10%, which raises for me sort of two questions for now. That we've made a demand for long, for the rich to sort of reduce their consumption. And is it sufficient? Is it sufficient or what else is necessary? And the second point is that how can this year's decline, which is about 7%, be sustained? Because our demand from a lot of groups, a lot of progressive organizations, is that the emissions decline must continue, and fall sharply over the next few years to be able to meet safe levels of warming. But how do we sort of do that without the kind of massive loss of jobs that we have seen this year, now moving forward? So what may change? One, of course, is the nature of economic recovery. So there are many opinions about how badly the economy how it might revive from being U-shaped or V-shaped. In my own view, it's more likely that there would be a long slowdown after maybe a deep rise for quite a few years. And why that's important is that over the last 50 years, for every 1% rise in the world's GDP, emissions have risen by 0.4 to 0.5%. And it worsened when manufacturing moved to China in the 1990s. The second thing that might change, of course, is elite behavior, which some of you have talked with me about. Tourism will get hit. It's already got hit massively. And we probably lost 120 million jobs, according to one estimate. Flying might decline, which some of you talked to me about in February and March. And this has a very high personal carbon footprint. And of course, socializing might decline, particularly by the elderly. People might sort of go out less to restaurants, etc. I'm talking about a post-COVID situation, mind you. All right. What else might change post-COVID? Now the next. One is, of course, whether the long supply chains and global trade, which is like something being produced somewhere and input into something very miles away. Your fruits that you might get in Khan Market or Green Park being imported from Australia, or your industrial inputs, etc. That certainly will change, but I think in my view, it will be less than we think. Transportation has already changed. We know of sort of cycle lanes coming up in a number of cities, and it's possible that those who can afford it might buy cars or other private vehicles because they want to avoid the health risks from COVID, but generally car sales would be subdued. One thing, of course, is that working from home, and people have talked about having more online meetings, etc. But what about the climate movement? I think it's strengthened intellectually in very, many ways. In many, many ways, I think our arguments have become stronger in a sense, because in a sense, what's happened this year is like an experiment on a world scale that would not ever happened before, and has shown us certain things of what is possible, despite local jobs. But politically, I must confess, the movement is quite weak. And because we now have to mostly stay at home and work online, we've lost a lot of a momentum that in fact was building up in the few weeks and months before the shutdown in different places. Now, one key point is that how will these changes face up? The changes that I talked about earlier, how will they face up to certain key structural trends over the last 20, 25, 30 years? I've talked about some already. I'm going to touch upon just 3 or 4. This is a staggering rate of urbanization. The reason I talk about urbanization is that a lot of the emissions, in fact, 70% worldwide, and about 65% in India, come from urban areas. And the point is that post-COVID, do we see a change in the rate of urbanization? Would it slow down slightly in India following reverse migration? I'm not sure, to be honest. It might very slightly. there's one trend that might well continue. The second trend that I talk about each time, but what surprises me that, how many meetings I go to which simply seem to be silent about this, is how it's spread in the last 25 or 30 years. And that's to do with a lot of the rise of the fact that in the last 25, 30 years, of all the carbon dioxide emissions since 1750, half of the 2.3 trillion tons of carbon dioxide have happened in the last 30 years. And this now covers a large part of the world's population and landmass. And this tendency is very central to capitalism. The tendency to accumulate, the tendency to grow and seek to maximize sort of profit. Capital doesn't just make profit, it sort of seeks to maximize it. Right? I'm not sure this also might slow down. This image that someone sent me, I don't know the source, is a Basti in Bombay. It might be Dharavi. And to me, it just epitomizes the inequality between the Basti on the one hand and a posh colony on the other. It's pretty central again to climate change as the second pillar. But one very key structural contribution to climate change is warfare, which again doesn't get talked about enough. War is central to climate change in both ways, both in terms of the energy it uses and in terms of the kind of wars that are carried out to try to corner oil and other materials. And this was from a paper recently, just simply numbers. So there's something that again is something that might well continue. I've already talked about trade as also a structural trend. I don't want to go into other structural trends here, but my point is that the changes that we were talking about earlier, whether they were behavioral, or whether they were systemic, whether they were economic, how do they face up to these? These are only 3 or 4. How do they face up to these structural trends that have unfolded in the last 3 decades? And whereas the demand for UBI has grown, in my sense, inequality is in fact going to increase. And that's something that I think we need to talk about. And this is central, the energy transition, which is going on for the last few years. But energy transition, which is basically moving away from fossil fuels towards more solar and wind, is not like a car reversing. In my image, it's like a very large ship turning, and it sort of turns like that, very, very slowly. And though it might have happened very strongly in certain sectors, in particular electricity, and that's reported a lot, because a lot of the changes happened in electricity. But the fact is that very often the reporting talks about capacity. But if we talk about electricity generation, it's actually less, it's actually slower. But it's only in certain sectors that a shift has already taken place significantly. But if you look at these sectors, which are very central to this energy transition, it's only very, very initial, including in cars, where if you have 10 million cars, electric cars by the end of this year, it's still only less than 1% of the number of cars worldwide, which are roughly 1.3 billion. So it's really massive. And what about India? Now, this was to me very sobering when I actually put it out. If you look at this, these 3 are fossil fuels. And mainly for India, it's coal and it's oil. Gas is a very small percent, it's about 6%. This is biomass, wood, twigs, leaves, etc., and so on, which is about 21%. And look at solar and wind, and I can barely put my cursor on it. You put it there, this data is a couple of years old, it's sort of gone up a bit. But solar, wind, hydro entirely as a part of India is just about 3%. And if you're talking about transition, if we want sort of move to a larger percentage of solar, wind, and other renewables, the key challenge is this. How do we move from this extremely small share that we are right now? To be honest, this is really quite sobering for me and quite a challenge. And though it's begun, it's again clearly, and though solar and wind have expanded, the point I'm making here is that as an actual portion of energy use, it's still quite small in India. All right. And my point also is that the use of coal and other fossil fuels needs to fall not just as a share, but they need to fall in absolute terms for emissions to dip. And these are estimates that the BP did last year for 2040. These numbers are all for 2040, and they're all a rise for both oil and gas. Coal stays roughly flat, it sort of dips slightly. But what's going to actually happen post-COVID for each of these fuels? I suspect that coal might sort of decline at a slightly faster rate. Earlier, there was talk of peak oil about a decade ago, that talk has kind of subsided. In recent days, there's now begun to be a talk of peak demand for oil. I don't think we're hitting peak demand as yet. It's going to fall for a couple of years and stay flat and then sort of rise again slowly. But what's slightly heartening is that the non-fossil fuels will rise at a faster rate post-COVID. But even here, mind you, I have a caveat, which when you talk of now non-fossil fuels, you're not only talking about wind and solar, you're also talking about nuclear, you're also talking about hydro, which a lot of us have understandably problems with, all right? And these are very likely emission scenarios post-COVID, which is a trend at a slightly slower rate going upward for carbon dioxide, and methane levels will rise faster. And mind you, the fall of this is just 4 billion tons this year. And this is what a key study by the IPCC said last year, which you need to fall by this much sharper rate for us to reach safer levels of warming, and for us to reach the targets in the Paris Agreement, which talk of 1.5 or 2 degrees C. And if the fall this year is just 4.4 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, including other gases, and we have to do this, how is that a challenge? And that depends a lot on us. And let's sort of as a relief, move away from numbers. And it depends on us, it depends on our struggles, it depends on the movement and the climate movement. And that was this last year. This was a sort of a young people's strike, a protest in Berlin last year. And this was the same thing this year, also in Germany. And the difference, of course, was that it was sort of virtual. People couldn't be present, but there have been strikes taking place, and the demand being made to sort of have a faster transition away from fossil fuels. And clearly what's happened this year shows the urgency of that. But again, that depends on movements. How fast we move away from fossil fuels depends a lot on us. It depends on all of us. It's not just my problem. It's not just a problem of the teachers group. It's a problem for all of us. And this is what some movements have been saying. This organization in Jharkhand has been protesting and sort of supporting Gran Sabha protests against this recent government move to auction sort of 41 blocks to any company who can sort of do it. It doesn't matter whether you've done coal before. It doesn't matter what you use it for. Those coal is up for, and it's in the most densely forested parts of India. It's where a lot of forest-dependent communities like Adivasi and others live, and they're going to be extremely gravely impacted in the years to come if this sort of happens. And a range of organizations worldwide have been talking of a faster shift away from fossil fuels. Unfortunately, though, the climate movement has been weakened by the fact that it's both very heavily NGOs and the fact that it's fragmented. So how actually it moves forward remains to be seen. And the impact it has also remains to be seen as yet. I've got a few suggestions. I've got a few slides left. Some very specific suggestions specific to India. So one slightly tricky thing is that I'm saying that even we can't just talk about even natural gas may need to be part of our energy basket. If the kind of energy mix that I talked about a few slides ago, if I said that coal and oil is such a massive part of our energy basket, then we may need to expand gas for a while in order to move away from coal. I would also suggest that we focus on urban areas because of the fact that more than 70% of emissions come from there. But a point also is this, that whatever our politics, whatever our range of politics, whether we're across the spectrum, including the left spectrum, we can't avoid engaging with certain systems. I've begun to refer to them as intermediate systems, and that includes particularly electricity, energy, and transport in cities, but even agriculture. We need to have to engage with these systems more and try to transform them if we have to make a shift. It doesn't matter what our politics is. And also suggest that tactically we sort of foreground air pollution, and particularly the fall that's happened this year in particular, and bring in other organizations and collectives for a more just transition. And what does just transition mean? It talks about not just a shift, but what does that transition mean for workers? What does it mean for other people working in coal areas? And particularly the fact because coal is expanding more in Eastern India, a lot of the wind power and solar power is coming up in Gujarat and Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu, etc. So how do we bring in people whose livelihoods may depend on coal and depend into the conversation? And one key point also is to ensure that we actually support struggles and not actually villainize them. That happens nowadays, and with different ways. Let me just end with the urgency of action. So the fact that the tipping points that I kind of began with in the very first slide will very soon not just tip over, some may already have, and we have very small windows to kind of ensure that those tipping points may not tip over. And the fact is that these are not sort of distant tipping points that will happen very far away. Because the kind of melting that will happen in Antarctica, on the Arctic, or elsewhere affects people here. The rate of sea level rise that will unfold, and that's going to unfold, mind you, for hundreds of years, is going to affect people in Tamil Nadu or in Orissa for hundreds of years. And if trajectories don't change, and this again is based on this report that I referred to earlier, which is a landmark report, which talks about these kind of acute levels of warming. And this, mind you, is something that, civilization has not seen. It's not going to be maybe as large as this report says for certain reasons, but these are certain levels of warming that we've never seen before in human history. And this is something that's going to certainly intensify. And, earlier I used to think that when this report talks about the end of the century, and, we think of the end of the century as being very, very far away, outside the lifetimes of most of us. And I suddenly realized that when they mean end of the century, this report by IITM is talking of actually this period. And my sister-in-law's kid, who's now 2 years old, is going to be my age in 2070. And suddenly it kind of hit me that the end of the century is actually not that far away. It's the midlife for people who are already born. I think that's something that we can't ever forget. I mean, there are multiple reasons that one can talk about why climate change is urgent. But I want to begin and end there. There is something that we can never ever forget. It's real, it hits the poor more, and it's going to happen in our lifetimes. It's not something that's very, very distant. Let me just end here with a few questions. So why is it that our response to climate change is so different from our response to COVID? Worldwide, not just in India, but I think it includes a lot of us. Why is it when climate change is something that is so far more grave than COVID in so many ways that one could talk about, And what does the state respond? The states worldwide, the Indian governments, different states, what does it tell us? How will they respond to crises that unfold in the future? If you've got sea level rise in the Sundarban, that's going to intensify. If you've got people migrating from coasts all over India's 7,000 kilometer coastline, who are forced to migrate like they did this year from the coast, how are state governments going to respond? How are we people going to respond? Is it going to be a kind of right-wing politics that we've seen, closing borders, not allowing people in, etc.? Or is there going to be a more radical response? And that depends not just on the state, it depends on society, because right-wing politics exists in society. It exists where we live. It's in our neighbors, etc. So what's going to actually happen? Will there be hopefully a more radical transformation of the energy landscape and also of politics, or is there going to be a right-wing assertion? Maybe more unlikely. And finally, what does our demand for a lower growth, which also done a more sustainable growth and a reduced energy use, which links to my slide about the global rise of energy use since 2009, a point I made earlier, which energy use is constantly growing because of growth. But what does a lower energy use mean for jobs and what does it mean for livelihood is something. And in India in particular, where about 77 million women have stepped out or have had to leave the job markets in 2004, what does jobs mean for women in particular in India? And finally, I'll stop with this. These are some known unknowns. The sun might possibly be in a low phase, and that might be for the last 50 years. I'm going to end with this slide. This happened, it's not as acute as happened in the mid 17th century in what is called the Maunder minimum, but it's something that's begun. And in fact, it's a way that actually, ironically, the Earth systems are helping us, both the sun as well as carbon sinks. These carbon sinks have been taking up more of our carbon dioxide for the last 50 years, possibly more. And it's not going to decline. But how long will they continue to do that? Already there's a discussion in the literature that some of these carbon sinks might start emitting carbon dioxide. The Arctic certainly will, permafrost certainly will, instead of sort of absorbing more. But one key unknown, like I mentioned earlier, is how long will the world continue economic crisis? And will there be a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, or a slow time recovery in the long term? And what is the strength of the force? And finally, are there viruses beyond under the ice? Whether it's in the term of permafrost, whether it's in the Arctic, or whether it's in the Himalayan glaciers, which I think was shown in a study last year, viruses sort of emerging from certain glaciers last year. And these are viruses that are unknown, of which human societies have no experience. Our bodies have no way of coping. So on a cheerful note, I think I'll end and thank you for joining.
Thank you, Naga. That was, it covers such a wide gamut of questions and really poses, I think, the sharp end of that. And so I'm sure there's much to think about and much to discuss. And we already have our first question actually. Barbara, will you come on and maybe ask it in person? Sorry, just before you do that, Barbara, there's one announcement that the subgroup of Teachers Against Climate Change, which is going to be discussing the curriculum, is planning to meet tomorrow. The details will be on an email, so please look out for that, those of you that are in the subgroup. Barbara, come on.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Thank you very much for a really comprehensive and fascinating tour d'horizon. I have a question really for everybody, but for Naga in the first instance. When we discuss progressive politics, can we mainstream two extra questions? One is, what institutions have to be in place for our evidence-based or our well-reasoned ideas to be able to move forward? And the second thing, which we need to mainstream, if I were a teacher, I would be teaching this all the time, is what are the obstacles? Who are the enemies? And where are the hostile forces against the suggestions that we make that are based in reason and science and evidence? And how can they be avoided or bought off or destroyed? So it's a question, it's perhaps another dimension of your talk, but whereas Naga, you have traced out the pathways of different movements, all these movements are facing obstacles. Otherwise the world would be a very different place. They've been in place for about 30 years. What do we do about incorporating an analysis of how to overcome those obstacles? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty central question. Can everybody hear me now? Yeah.
We can hear you, I think.
Yeah, okay. No, I think that's a pretty central question. I mean, the part that I think I could respond to easier is the question about obstacles. I mean, one very clear obstacle is the enemy that the climate change movement has focused on in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, which is the fossil fuel companies. So in many places, say including here in India, people like Joe or others have been talking about trying to pressurize institutions to sort of reduce their financing, banks and other places to sort of reduce their financing to fossil fuel companies. Movements elsewhere have talked about keeping fossil fuels on the ground. So that is very clearly, I think, one clear, in a sense, enemy and so on. And if you look at the level of investment that's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, it's actually quite shocking about the kind of subsidies that have gone out to fossil fuel companies. The slightly more worrying concern for me is that what do we do when the state is itself a very large financer, supporter and promoter of very large fossil fuels? And particularly that's the case in China. I was mentioning China earlier and why China is so central. What do we do in the fact that China is producing 62% of the world's steel in May? China is consuming half the world's coal and half the world's steel. And this is largely financed by public sector banks, by the Chinese government, and so on. So I think in terms of who is the enemy and whom we focus on, I would think that it's very clear, I think, is the fossil fuel companies, and I think it's sort of in some senses the state. But to me, more central is the system at large, and this might seem quite general. There's a lot of focus on Trump and President Trump and what he does. But to me, actually a far greater problem than Trump is actually the logic of the system, which is a system of constant expansion, a tendency to accumulate, which is what I was saying earlier about the growth in emissions being sort of half in the last 30 years as it has been since 1750. And that's partly because capital has sort of spread in the directions and ways and intensified to areas. And so in a sense, I don't think we can actually forget that as And how do we target that, I think, is actually the challenge. I think movements are sort of trying more and more. The fact is, I think we need to recognize the fact the movement so far has been very heavily NGOized, and more than that, to some degree, it's been fragmented. In a sense, it's a different movement. It's a different movement from the traditional working class movements. I think we need to accept the fact that this movement is very decentralized, has very decentralized strategies, and that may have also its positives. But I think it also needs to face up to its negatives. I'm not sure that answered the question sufficiently, Barbara. That was the best I can do with short notice.
So Suhas Kolikar first, and then Shouvik after.
Thanks. Everybody is talking about the recovery of economy, but I would request all the climate experts to make the warning so loud and clear so that the economy doesn't go ahead in the same direction. It's a must that the economy has to rethink and change the direction of more green and people-oriented, livelihood saving kind of economy. And people's movements have been working in that direction for long. So how do we work together? I'm from National Alliance of People's Movement, so this is my concern. Thank you.
Suhas, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, there's certainly what we have seen in the last few weeks and months is a very intensified argument for a much slower rate of growth. Just simply the fact that pollution levels are falling the way that they have. So how do we, in Delhi, when you see it, it's so visible. What is done to other species? How do we ensure that that carries on and we can maintain lower levels of pollution, which have very deep impacts on health, very deep unequal impacts on people's lives? How do we ensure that while also ensuring that people's jobs don't get taken away? I think the question of jobs is quite central to our argument. And until we are able to sort of address that question centrally, I think we'll find we will be, I think, on a weak footing. I think we need to be able to address how would we generate jobs for working people while having a much lower, and there have been arguments made for it, but how do we generate jobs on the scale required? When India has probably 15 million people, young people joining the workforce every year. China last year had 8.74 million graduates alone. How are we going to generate jobs for them at a lower rate of growth? That's one problem. The other problem is simply the logic of the system, which I showed the rate of energy rise, is that it's going to simply rise as an economy becomes larger and larger, even at a slower rate of growth. Its uses of material, its uses of coal, its uses of other resources grows, even if it's growing at a slower rate. And that to me is a very serious problem. So there's a very strong argument for degrowth and post-growth, but it's a strong intellectual argument. The problem is how do we translate that into a political argument and make it more widely acceptable so that it can be part of the campaign of people's organizations, just like the demand for a higher rise in agricultural prices for their produce. How will they also demand other kinds of demands which make it sort of more feasible?
Shouvik?
Hi Naga, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for the excellent presentation. One thing at the end of your presentation, which you mentioned, and I've been thinking about this, in the US, we see that with the Trump administration, since it's like a climate denier and there is no projects being taken for renewable energy or any such, or any initiative to fight the climate change. You find the state governments are really taking up initiatives at a very high level, at their individual levels, like the state of California, the state of New York, Maine, and since we are very well involved with many of the state projects with the trade unions and as well as the government, so we know these states are trying to come up with their own policies to fight or to at least reduce, I will say in that sense, the usage of fossil fuels. So I am wondering, like, given the framework in India, and Modi similarly we know is very similar to Trump, maybe a climate denier himself. So is it possible for the state governments to take up any such initiatives at the individual level, at the state level? And will it be or is it something which is holding us back? Maybe the center-state financial relationship or the constitutional framework. Is it possible for the states to now actively participate in this fight at the individual state level, rather than looking at the central government?
So in India, I think
Thank
as far as, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm done.
Yeah. In India, as far as states are concerned, we can different in two ways. One is about emissions and the other is about adaptation to climate change. So in adaptation, there's a lot of variation. So for instance, let's say Orissa copes with cyclones better than say Bengal does, because it's had the mega cyclone in 1999 and they learned from that experience. Or as an example, some states might have better ways of coping, or at least they have plans in place for, let's say, heat stress, which is a mild example. But let's say Ahmedabad has a plan, Surat has a plan, a few other cities have a plan, etc. So there might be some variation in the ways that different states may adapt to climatic impacts. However, as far as emissions are concerned, the variation is very, very slight. And that's partly because we've got an increasingly centralized government where the Indian federalism and the federal structure has been very weakly deepened. And as far as energy policy is concerned, not just is it very deeply unequal, which is to say that a lot of people don't have access to energy in a lot of states very unevenly, despite the fact of India's capacity having trebled in the last few years. There's still millions of people who don't have access to energy. But it's also a fact that it's very deeply uneven, and their capacity to intervene is also limited by their fiscal position. The fact that it in fact was a very interesting article, a very good one, in fact, by Navroz Dubash and others in the India Forum last year, when he talked of the non-price barriers to the expansion of solar and wind. So it's not just the fall in the price of solar and wind, but also the political economy, the political barriers due to which, and also the institutional barriers about the fact of what these thermal power plants or other coal utilities, etc., face, political barriers, etc., in the expansion of solar and wind. So the range of factors, Souvik, which I think makes the Indian context quite different from the American context. In the American context, I might just say two things, which is that American emissions are in sort of long-term decline since 2005, but you look at American per capita emissions, it's still shockingly high. And, and coal emissions, etc., are still sort of rising. They dipped last year. But overall, I would say the contexts are very, very different, both in terms of emissions as well as,
Okay, Kavya next.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, sir. First of all, thank you so much for putting things into perspective. It was a very enlightening session. I wanted to know that considering the state of economies right now and all this economic slowdown that we're having because of COVID, is it likely that governments will focus on climate in their policies? Because everyone is basically just struggling to get back on their feet very aggressively right now.
That's true.
And
which governments are you referring to?
Governments in general, but also specifically India. Right. So, even if there are people's movements and, we raise alarm about all of this, is it not going to be subdued as it is? I mean, we raise alarm about so many things and they're all snubbed. So and this is going to be something that, even the public is in general very stressed about the state of the economy. So is it not going to be very secondary for everyone?
Yeah, and unfortunately, you're absolutely right. In one of my slides, I had sort of presented what the Indian government has done in the last few days and weeks, which includes the dilution of the norms under EIA which also includes diluting norms for coal, for washing coal,
Yeah.
And as you know, other sort of measures which we're bring out, but there's also other sort of states, and it's actually true that many governments. There are a few exceptions. I believe South Korea is talking of a Green New Deal. I believe there are measures sort of being carried out in Europe, which enable less damage. So there are a few exceptions to the general trend, but the general trend is true that, and that's sort of shown again and again, which is that as soon as an economy goes under stress, it's not just climate change. In general, people tend to give environmental concerns and put it on the back burner. And that's really a pity, because in many ways, climate change is far, far, far worse a problem than COVID. But that's actually the challenge, right? How are we going to deal with pollution, deal with climate change, and still generate jobs? That too, I think, to me is just a key question. That's something that I think I'm now repeating myself. So with the transition, we can enable a certain kind of transition, which enable, and in fact, Shavik and Rohit have a study show that actually jobs from solar and wind are significantly higher than jobs from fossil fuels in India. So at a certain level of investment, the jobs you can generate are more than from coal. But like I said earlier, the nature of the jobs are different, and because the working conditions are quite different, they're not unionized.
Thank you, sir.
Vandana?
Yeah, I was just thank you, Naga. This was a really, really wonderful and useful kind of bird's eye view, as well as diving into the key details. I was just intrigued, well, by a number of things, but I'll just ask about one, which is that can you comment on the looking at the COVID response, which differs quite a bit around the world. What can we learn from it with regard to moving forward strategically on climate? This was one of your questions, and I just wanted to kind of ask it back in a sense to see if you have any further thoughts on it.
Well, I was sort of putting that as a question because I was hoping that sort of others might come into the conversation as well and make it a discussion rather than just me responding. It's also, I think, more democratic if we give more time to other people to share their own thoughts rather than just me speaking. Having said that, initially there were very few positive signs from this crisis, in particular the development of cycle paths in a number of cities, in particular the fact that some states elsewhere, and including possibly India, were willing to take over private hospitals and transfer them into the public domain. I think if there's one thing that the COVID crisis has shown us, despite so many others, is that essential services which are needed for the people need to be in the public domain. We need to have hospitals, and that's particularly the case in India. And I think that's something that we had a sort of slight hope in certain places. And there probably were a few others that I can think of where we could sort of potentially move forward. I think also, like I was saying earlier, that the intellectual argument for a slower rate of growth, after all, we can't forget that the COVID virus, it is shown now, possibly came because certainly pandemics sort of arise from deforestation, right? And we can't just sort of carry on at this rate at which we are sort of destroying the planet. In many ways, the arguments that we've made, many of us have made for, and many of us were, not just me, but a lot of you were in the audience, many others, many organizations, that we need a slower rate of growth, etc. We need a post-growth, we need a transformation. So many other kinds of arguments have got completely vindicated in the last few weeks. Unfortunately, it's only right now an intellectual argument. I think our role is to transform that into a stronger political argument. But I really do hope that large people's organizations are more open to these questions right now, because that's the only way, with larger organizations taking this forward, making this part of their agenda, that I think we can accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. Otherwise, the tipping points that I started and ended with are going to tip over. And that's going to be absolutely disastrous. I mean, the urgency is something that none of us can ever forget. So there are some positives, but there's also a lot of things to worry. And one of the worrying things is how the right wing in different ways, including right wing regimes, have sort of used the crisis, and how capital has also used the crisis in different ways. And I think that to me is probably more weighty and very concerning.
Hello.
Sorry, so the number of questions is increasing, so I'm going to ask you to take a couple of them.
I need to. Hello. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Matadri, keltate.
Yes. Naga, we are very proud of you. It is a super presentation. But by and large, the discussion on climate change leads us to a very depressing kind of the future for the world at large. And for the Indian society in particular. Because the ruling classes take every opportunity to ignore any fight against the kind of climate change that we have. As you have emphasized, I mean, as we have been noticing, number of reform measures that they have introduced now are going to be against is going to be a big setback against the Paris Agreement and what have you. Now, the question I have before me is that, is it that the world is going to move in this direction where the ruling classes are invariably becoming much more conservative, less progressive, and therefore we will continue to face, as you said, Uma by 1970 will be of your age, and she will face much more serious problems than what we are facing today. I am saying that if capitalism is proved to be a dynamic set of institutions, will it find slowly and gradually some effort to correct the imbalances that are taking? Is there some hope? Can there be some hope? That is my question.
Yeah. So Appa, there are in technologies, there are people who talk about, so one reason for hope I must tell you is that in India itself, the expansion of solar and wind has been pretty impressive in recent years. So if we take the last 3 years, capacity has increased by about 30 gigawatts, whereas coal thermal is just 9. That's also in many ways. So for instance, if you take electricity, there's more last year from renewables than from coal. There are sort of some shifts that are taking place slowly, but as I pointed out, they're still at a very initial stage. The other possibility of hope is some people talk about is what's happening with other technologies. So a friend of mine from Pune was recently, just a few days ago, talking about the development of hydrogen technologies and the possibility that the development of hydrogen as a source of energy could be used at, and it has the of being also energy dense. So it doesn't face the kind of limitations that, let's say, jet fuel does. So it's a reason why you can't fly on a battery, because you need fuel. So technologically speaking, there might be maybe. The problem is that one, that they have their own constraints. Even those technologies face a lot of constraints right now. To expand them to scale needed quite a while, and it will take a lot of energy. And the deeper problem is what I had said earlier, which is that when you've got a system which is under constant expansion, then you're going to face intensifying problems for a while. The point is how bad. That actually is the key question. Because those things that I talked about earlier going forward, not just with tip, but what we do now depends of how quickly they unfold. Something that might take, let's say, 1,000 years to unfold, it happen in 100 years, we don't intervene. That is one of the many reasons why we need to intervene. Politically, the scene right now is not very encouraging. So right-wing elites will use the climate crisis. That's one of the worrying things for me, just like they're using the COVID crisis to push through certain anti-people reforms or push through. Yeah, so it is, to be honest with you, not very encouraging, but it depends on us. And there might be some signs of hope, but they are very initial right now. I'm sorry, but I must be honest. I must be honest to what information I have and what that tells me. I would like to live on hope, but I prefer analysis.
Okay, so there's a lot of questions coming up and we don't have very much more time. So I'm going to ask people to ask their questions one after the other. So first Simran, then Rajeshwari, then Suhas, and then Prabhu. So can you take 4, Naga?
Yeah. Hi, I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Very quick comments first. Naga, you mentioned that different states are prepared differently for climate response. You gave the example of Odisha. I think disaster response should not be confused with climate response, primarily because the narrative in the cyclone is also natural. It's still a natural phenomena and is not really considered as a result of a climate change. We can debate on the intensity, but the larger narrative is still, as a natural phenomena and disaster management. So if we look at states, there are very few initiatives when we talk about preparedness to climate response.
I agree.
So that's one. Very quick comment on Shraumik's questions also. States in India definitely have the capacity, and especially given the concurrency of some of the subjects, energy, water, forestry, they can definitely take a lot of initiative. But what we are looking at increasingly is the centralization of decision making. If we look at recently the tariff policy or the amendments proposed to the Electricity Act, we are increasingly looking at centralization. And the second concern is obviously the dwindling capacities within the state to look at these niche subjects, which are and do necessary research and analysis to develop evidence-based policy. My quick query or last question or comment is the narrative around, as you said, the political narrative around climate change is not very conducive. And one of my major concerns is that people who are really affected by it are still very, they're not very aware about it, right? So jobs are not going to affect only for coal miners and people in the industry, but also for farmers, for people who are dependent on forestry, people who are dependent on fisheries, etc. Right? So, do you suggest any possibilities, or has there been any precedent where people have become actively involved in the climate change narrative? And so, from a last mile mitigation and response perspective. Thank you.
Let's see a couple of questions, Anish, together.
Rajeshwari.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Nagaraj, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the lecture, but I'm a little worried about the way, not just you, and we all speak about capitalism and progressive left and systems demand, systems changes that we want, and so on. But both capitalism and the left, in the sense the idea of structural transformation, this structural reform that progress, or let's say as an economy develops, is common to both. And I'm just wondering how we answer the energy question without getting into this fundamental, well, structural transformation question. The world has been through a massive structural transformation, moving people, hands that work as the basic energy inputs, to substituting them with capital inputs, more and more energy intensive inputs, and so on. And we have to, I don't know, I mean, your last slide seemed to have all the 4 points which can converge if we would step out of this structural transformation thinking. And I think that's my worry. I mean, that we're not talking about the biggest systems change that we can actually make is to just do away with this hope that developmentalism gives us about structural transformation, and that the path that every country should follow is structural transformation. More and more value added from industry and service sector, less and less value added from the primary sector, all that. Yeah, thank you.
So Naga, I think that's already quite a few questions. We want to take those and then
okay.
Suhasin Prabhu right after.
Well, I'll try to respond to that. But also, if other people wish to respond, I mean, feel free. This can also be a discussion.
Yeah.
Rajeshwari, as in, I'm sort of broadly in agreement with you. I mean, I think, there are a lot of organizations, not just you, but also a lot of organizations have talked about the significance of moving away from private, just simply to lower levels of growth, trying to giving more importance to the primary sector, to basic people's livelihoods and how that can be generated. There was recently, I think, mails from Ashish about focusing on not just on jobs, but also on livelihoods in general. And it's also the case in other countries. I mean, if you look at where they are right now, it's probably where India was maybe 50 years ago. My problem though is the logic of the system. If you look at what's happened with the spread of agriculture, I can't get away from the spread of capitalism in India, and that's something that you know as well or better than me, including in agriculture, which is something that you work on. It's the way in which agriculture has sort of transformed in the last maybe 20 years, necessary towards, with large companies in the markets coming in. And that's also the case with the other problem that I also face, the way in which sort of fossil fuel, commercial-based energies are very much, sort of widening and spreading. And to some degree, I think they should. So the problem is not, in a sense, about how one might look at a problem, but how do we face up to the trends that are kind of unfolding in the last 15, 20 years in India? How do we kind of take those on? That to me is to me a sort of central challenge, really. And that's something that I can't very easily get away from. That's something I want to talk about today. I'm not sure that exactly answers your question, but yeah, something I would.
No, I agree. Yes, we need to think of capitalism in various ways. It's just that I thought I'd raise this. Thanks. Thank you.
There was Simran's questions earlier.
Yeah, sorry.
Naga, are you happy with sort of the answers to Simran as well? In that?
Yeah. So people not being aware of, wasn't that question?
Yeah.
How that's sort of.
Yeah, basically the last mile citizens being not the part of the climate change narrative and the movement.
Yes. Well, I think it's over the last 10 years or so, there's certainly been shifts that have been happening. I think one, mainly because intense events like flooding, like the Uttarakhand flood, the Chennai flood, the Kerala floods, etc., have been beamed into people's homes, into their drawing rooms. And whether or not a particular event is connected to climate change, nowadays people assume that it's because of climate change. And so there's a far greater receptivity to climate change in general than there was a decade ago. A decade ago, it took a lot of us a lot more effort to try to convince people that climate change was a really grave and pressing issue. It's far more acceptable now. My problem though is that it's still not translated. It still does not seem to, impact either very deeply at the institution, at the individual level, and more importantly, at the political level for unions. Now, how that shift is, I think, is something that is a key shift going forward. As in, how do we translate the greater awareness of climate crisis into sort of organizational demands, into it becoming a sort of political issue? Very clear that hasn't as yet. And that's I think the challenge for all of us to kind of engage with climate change. There have, I think, been some organizations, trade unions, for instance, in India, I think are slowly changing their position, and in particular because they're concerned with the shift away from fossil fuels and what that might do for jobs and for workers in different places. So there is also greater engagement by trade unions, by social collectives like NAPM, by a few far left organizations, main left organizations. But to be honest, I don't think they reflect the urgency that the situation warrants. And it needs to get translated. I mean, if you look at the key demands from the farmers' march last year, it was for higher, prices for their produce, and that's completely valid. It's perfectly understandable. But to me, what was very striking was how climate change was completely absent in the key demands. And I would think that small farmers are one of the largest social groups in India already to be impacted by climate change. And the same goes for women's organizations. In my view, underprivileged women, poor women are already the largest single group in India already to be impacted in climate change. Where does it get reflected in the demands from women's organizations? I don't see it sufficiently as yet. I think it's going to happen, but it's happening too slowly.
Okay, so we're just going to quickly, I think this is going to be the last round of questions. So very briefly, Suhas, Prabhu, Rama, and Sagar. So 4 questions there.
My question earlier is partly answered by Naga, but I wanted to add that when he said about the number of jobs, there is no need to compare the number of jobs within the energy sector, because I think we should take this sort of opportunity to politicize the issues and interconnections. One thing is saving energy, so changing all our instruments to the alternative energy needs kind of things. I'm sure that even the instruments will have to be adopted to the different patterns probably. And another thing is, because of the climate crisis, it is likely that there would be number of jobs if we really want to be prepared for facing the disasters with minimal damage to people, and also for the possibilities of other pandemics coming because of the heat waves and melting glaciers. So the viruses are going to get mutated with the failing of forest, as he also said. So we have to make a politically approachable narrative interconnecting all these things, not just limiting to the energy alternatives. I think that's the way to go forward, and I would like others to comment on my suggestion. Thank you.
Prabhu?
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, please.
Okay. I think I have 2 questions. First is, or 2 comments and question. Naga, the first is that actually speaking, the way you presented it, say you yourself said that we cannot have this growth scenario all the time, but we cannot also have continuously looking at the question of jobs. People, we must think that it is possible to reverse it. Whether we think or not, people are forced to reverse it. Forced to reverse the so-called, what Rajeshwari's pointed out, that kind of underlying narrative of structural transformation, almost like a law of nature. It's like a law of nature. We can't help it, just like we cannot help climate change to an extent. We cannot help it as long as we have this structural transformation. So we can only mitigate to a certain extent. But the real problem, actually, Rajeshwari's point is said, we must really think, how is it a law of nature that everyone must move from countryside to the cities? And because it has happened only in the last 200 years, this is the model. Why should it be? It will be forced. And it was not always like that. There are enough evidence, even inside India, that it was not like that. Say in the decades in the 50s and 60s, it was not possible that cities could not absorb. So there was actually what people would call pushback. You know, people couldn't come to the cities, they pushed back. Perhaps it had other consequences. So one must have to think, if urbanization is so directly linked to it, and you have shown that 70% of this thing comes from urbanization, what would happen if we have a goal of de-urbanization? Why not just think? We have to think through that. Otherwise, we are all the time would be only doing mitigation, and the kind of political way forward, or the thing which has been suggested, would appear, you know, well, it's not feasible, it is not possible to do it. So I think there's something, the way we frame the question has to change. I don't know how to say it, but it is very clear. It has to change. We cannot have that, okay, we need 1.5% decline as the goal and have the states as the main actors, if we do not think of an alternative to that. Let's think of it like that, that we need that each system or each particular systems have creates niches and ecosystems around them. Each particular energy use, okay, it creates ecosystem. Now, if these ecosystems have to sharply transform themselves, what will happen? So, for instance, say we are thinking of renewables, but what is the energy, whatever the thing about the biomass? There was some discussion, I think, earlier in the group about biomass. What is the change which will take place? Today I was reading this guy, Ratan Lal, who was saying that we really need to plow back into the soil a lot of these nutrients which are getting lost. And these are the biggest reason for the shift which are happening, soil depletions. So now if we think of these ecosystems, transforming these ecosystems and having, imagining these new ecosystems, we must not just say that, look, you know, we can only change energy sources. We can change the ecosystems of these energy sources. I'm not clear perhaps in this, but I really want you to take this thing really, sorry, yeah, okay.
Naga, before you answer, just because I think this will have to be the last round. So can we just take Rama and Sagar? I think Sagar might talk about biomass. Sorry, Rama, are you there? Just in case she's not. She asked about sort of more direct movement solutions that would fire up students to mobilize and engage more actively with sustainable choices and solutions. What would individuals do en route to joining forces and building the massive momentum needed at the demand side? Yeah. So that was Rama's question. She written it down in the chat. So you can have it there as well. Sagar, do you want to just come up and ask a question?
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, speak up a bit.
Can you hear
Sagar,
me?
Sagar, speak up slightly, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Hello,
that's
can
better,
you hear
Sagar.
me?
Much better.
Can you hear me now?
We can, Sagar, yeah, speak up. Yes, we can.
Yeah. Naga, my question is basically, in the short term, yes, you know, there can be some attempt to try and shift over to gas. There is a lot of politics involved with it. I won't get into all the politics of, you know, gas acquisition and so on and so forth. But in the medium and long term, what is your understanding of what is the energy source that is going to be available to human society, which is deployable? I make a difference between what is theoretically available and what is deployable. Like, for example, something like theoretically 1200 terawatts of wind is available, but the actual deployable wind energy is only about 5% of the current global energy use, which is about 5 terawatts. So it's a lot less, than what people theoretically calculate as what is available. This is my first question, because basically it moves us into a dimension of what is our technology choice. Okay. The second thing is that we don't pay adequate attention to energy distribution, which I'm not talking of energy distribution as an engineering methodology of how to distribute it. I'm talking about it as an economic distribution and a political distribution. And I think that's as vexing a problem as, what is our future energy? So how do we distribute energy? Because that is going to actually play a massive role in the play out of what technology choices we have in the future. Let me start with just these two questions.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Also, I will respond. If also other people want to come in, let them also be free. I guess let this be a conversation. तो सुहास जो आपका जो प्रश्न था regarding political alternative, मैं अंत में जो है I kind of indicated a few points towards which I think that one needs to move forward. There are a lot of in some sense also responsible. There are a lot of very real alternatives. One need not be even abstract or theoretical. There are a lot of very real alternatives that existed in the recent past or do exist in practice. I mean, one such which I think no one talks about is what the CPI Maoist Party tried in Dandakaranya, and I read a very fine journalist report on it. That journalist ironically got an award for that report from Manmohan Singh, and it talked about what the CPI Maoist was doing in that area regarding agriculture, regarding building small ponds, regarding sustainable agriculture, regarding low and various other measures that they were trying out. Other attempts nowadays at a more sort of decentralized local level, as you know better than me, are being tried out in a number of places. And in Vikalp, Ashish and others, Ashish Kotari and others, I think are giving them prominence in a way that are needed. There are challenges, including the challenge of scaling up. One question for us is, do we need state presence for a certain kind of transformation? This was recently sort of put forward by a guy called Andreas Malm, where he talked about ecological Leninism. And it's something we can't rubbish. If you look at the Kerala's response to COVID, Kerala is the only state that's had a half decent response in India. And one reason why that's the case is because the CPM is in power there. That I think is one sort of challenges. But despite that, in terms of political alternatives, it is not just a question of energy. My point though today, because I was focusing on emissions, is to say that whatever your politics, you cannot but engage with transformations at an intermediate level. We have to engage with transformations with transport, transformations with electricity, transformations in industry. It doesn't matter what your politics is, whether you're far left or whether you're far right. We cannot reduce emissions without an engagement and a transformation of those systems. That's the kind of point I was going to make today. And please believe me, that's both very difficult and at one level quite boring. It's one thing sort of saying, keep fossil fuels on the ground. It's another thing campaigning for more buses in Delhi. It's very, very difficult and it's very, very boring. So that's, I think, one point I'm trying to make today. Prabhu, regarding a point about deurbanization, I'm completely in support for you. 25 years ago, when we were part of the Delhi Janwadi Adhikar Manch, and when working people have been targeted both by industry and in their bastis, and there were demolitions taking place, there were reports that this collective wrote, Delhi Janwadi Adhikar Manch, of which some of us were a part, talking about the nature of development, talking about the need to develop urban, to develop sort of rural and semi-rural areas in certain ways. And there's a very wide literature on that. I am in no illusion that that is something that we need. The point is, what are the trends? I am looking at what do the facts tell me? And the facts tell me what that Harvard prof put out of the rate of urbanization. That there are 1.3 million people joining urban areas every 10 days worldwide. how do I face up to that? It's something I can't run away from. And that's something that, so I'm complete agreement with you that we need a different imagination. The point again is that how does that imagination get taken forward politically is for me a challenge. Sagar, I'm not sure that and regarding deployable sources, Sagar, I mean, again, I don't want to get stuck in technical discussions about energy. I think clearly that's something that we need to go beyond. I mean, I would think that primarily solar is, I think, one way to go. I think you yourself have some writings showing how solar is, essential to the possibility of an energy transformation. But again, like I think Suhas is saying, it's not merely a question of a technological shift. I think it's also links to a larger sort of social or political transformation, and also to the question of inequity. I mean, inequity is completely central. Like I said earlier, inequity and capitalism are at the core of energy inequality and climate change. And like I'd also said, despite our India tripling capacity, tens of millions of people, possibly 200, 250 million people, still don't have access to even electricity. It's very deeply unequal. So, in a sense, if we talk about just transformation, I think an access to energy needs to be very central. So, how is it possible with these technologies? Maybe with more decentralized solar, where people may have more control about how it's used, where it's deployed, and where it's deployed, rather than as is happening now, where urban areas are, using up both fossil fuels, shifting to electric. The electric is coming from coal, drawing on solar. So Delhi's metro runs almost entirely on solar. That solar is from a solar park in Madhya Pradesh. What's happened to agricultural land there, etc. So I think it ranges to a lot of questions about our development trajectory. And if I focus today more on, certain energies, there's a reason I've done so, but it links very strongly to our trajectories. And deployable, I think, I don't think we don't pay enough attention to inequity. I think we do pay a lot of attention to the question of distribution. I think what we don't pay enough attention to is inherent tendencies of capital. That is something that at least most meetings I attend are completely silent about. Another thing that's not paid enough attention to other species, which I couldn't talk about today, but anyway, inequity, I would think we do in different ways. We do. And if you look at I think I've talked enough.
Okay, I think we have to call it an evening there. I mean, as always, it's been very, very stimulating. And as always, the conversations have, I think, in a very full way, brought together questions of politics and questions of science. And so I hope people will join in the next talk in the series, which I believe will be Chirag. Is that right? Will be happening in a couple of weeks. So looking forward to that. Thank you very much, Naga, for a stimulating and wonderful presentation.
And thanks, Anish.
Thank you. Thanks, Nagraj. Thank you.
Thank you, Nagraj.